Marcus Thompson had always been curious about the small, faded patch tucked away in his grandfather's old wooden box. The box sat on his bedroom dresser, filled with random items his grandfather had left behind when he passed away 3 years ago. There were old coins, a broken watch, some yellowed photographs, and this mysterious military patch that seemed different from anything Marcus had ever seen. The patch was roughly 3 inches wide, with intricate embroidery that had faded over the decades. It showed what looked like a lightning bolt surrounded by wings with some kind of shield design underneath. The colors were muted now. What might have once been bright blues and golds had turned into dull grays and browns. Along the bottom there were letters that Marcus could barely make out, though he couldn't understand what they meant. Marcus was 24 years old and worked at a local auto repair shop in small-town Nebraska. He had never been particularly interested in military history, or anything related to the armed forces. His grandfather, William Thompson, had rarely talked about his time in the service. In fact, Marcus couldn't remember his grandfather ever mentioning the military at all during family gatherings, or their quiet fishing trips together. What made the patch even more mysterious was that Marcus had never seen his grandfather wear it or display it anywhere in his house. It was simply tucked away in this box with other forgotten items as if it held no special meaning. But something about it nagged at Marcus. The craftsmanship was clearly professional, and despite its age, he could tell it had once been something important. One evening, while cleaning out his apartment, Marcus decided to take a closer look at the patch. He held it up to the light, trying to make out the faded details. The lightning bolt design was clearer now, and he could see that the wings were more elaborate than he had initially thought. There seemed to be some kind of motto written around the edge, but the letters were too worn to read clearly. Marcus had inherited more than just his grandfather's belongings. He had also inherited his grandfather's quiet nature and his tendency to keep family history to himself. His father, David, had always said that Grandpa William was a man of few words who preferred action over conversation. But now, with his grandfather gone, Marcus realized how little he actually knew about the man who had taught him to fish, helped him with his first car, and had always been there for Sunday dinners. The next day at work, Marcus mentioned the patch to his coworker, Jake, who was known for his interest in military collectibles. Jake examined the patch carefully, turning it over in his hands and squinting at the faded details. "This looks like something special," Jake said, handing it back to Marcus. "I've seen a lot of military patches, but this one is different. The design is really detailed and you can tell it was made to last. Most regular unit patches don't have this kind of craftsmanship." Jake suggested that Marcus take the patch to the local Veterans Affairs office, or maybe visit the military surplus store downtown. The owner there, a retired Army sergeant named Bob Martinez, knew more about military history than anyone else in town. That weekend, Marcus decided to visit Bob's military surplus. The store was cramped and filled with everything from old uniforms to camping gear, and the walls were covered with military memorabilia from different eras. Bob was behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his 60s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When Marcus showed him the patch, Bob's expression changed. He put down the inventory sheet he was working on and asked Marcus to hand over the patch. Bob examined it under a magnifying glass, turning it over several times and looking at it from different angles. "Where did you get this?" Bob asked, his voice more serious than it had been moments before. Marcus explained about his grandfather and how he had found the patch in his belongings. Bob nodded slowly, still studying the patch with intense concentration. "I'm not entirely sure what this is," Bob admitted, "but I can tell you it's not from any regular military unit. This kind of detailed embroidery, this particular design, it looks like it might be from some kind of special operations group or maybe a classified unit. During certain periods of military history, especially during and after World War II, there were units that operated under different rules and had their own unique patches." Bob handed the patch back to Marcus and leaned against the counter. "Your grandfather never talked about his military service?" Marcus shook his head. "Not that I can remember. My dad always said Grandpa was private about that stuff. We just knew he had served, but he never went into details." "That's not uncommon," Bob said. "A lot of veterans from certain units or certain time periods don't talk about their service. Sometimes it's because of classification issues. Sometimes it's just personal preference." Bob suggested that Marcus do some research or maybe contact the National Archives to see if he could find his grandfather's military records. He also mentioned that there was going to be a veterans reunion event at the local community center next month, where many older veterans would be gathering. Someone there might recognize the patch or at least be able to point Marcus in the right direction. As Marcus left the surplus store, he felt a growing sense of curiosity about his grandfather's past. The man he had known as a quiet, gentle grandfather who loved fishing and fixing old cars might have had an entirely different life during his younger years. The patch was like a key to a door Marcus hadn't even known existed. That evening, Marcus called his father to ask about his grandfather's military service. David was surprised by the question, but admitted that he didn't know much either. William had never been one to share stories about his time in the service, and the family had learned not to ask too many questions about it. I always figured he just didn't want to relive whatever he had experienced during the war, David told Marcus over the phone. But now that you mention it, I do remember him getting letters from the Veterans Administration occasionally, and once in a while, old military buddies would call. He always took those calls in private. Marcus hung up the phone with even more questions than before. His grandfather had clearly maintained some connections to his military past, but he had kept that part of his life completely separate from his family. The patch was becoming more than just a curious family artifact. It was becoming a mystery that Marcus felt compelled to solve. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus threw himself into researching his grandfather's military background with a determination that surprised even him. He had never been much of a researcher, preferring hands-on work to sitting behind a computer. But something about the mysterious patch had awakened a curiosity he didn't know he possessed. His first stop was the local library, where a helpful librarian named Mrs. Chen showed him how to access military databases and historical records online. Marcus learned that his grandfather had served during the Korean War era, from 1951 to 1954. But beyond basic service dates, the records were frustratingly vague. There were no details about his specific unit, his duties, or where he had been stationed. Sometimes military records are incomplete or classified, Mrs. Chen explained as Marcus stared at the sparse information on the computer screen. Especially for certain types of units or operations, you might have better luck contacting the National Personnel Records Center directly. Marcus spent his lunch breaks at the library, searching through military history websites and forums. He posted photos of the patch on several military collector sites, hoping someone might recognize the unusual design. The responses were mixed. Some people thought it looked like a special forces patch. Others suggested it might be from an intelligence unit, and a few believed it could be from a classified program. One response particularly caught his attention. A military historian from Texas wrote that the patch design reminded him of units that were involved in behind-the-lines operations during the Korean War. These were often small, elite groups that operated independently and maintained strict secrecy about their missions. Many of these units, the historian explained, had their own custom patches that were never officially documented. At home, Marcus began going through his grandfather's belongings more systematically. He had initially only looked through the wooden box, but now he searched dresser drawers, closets, and even the basement storage area. In a dusty corner of the basement, he found an old footlocker that he had never noticed before. The footlocker was locked, but Marcus managed to open it with a screwdriver. Inside, he discovered a treasure trove of his grandfather's past. Old photographs, letters, a few medals in small boxes, and several documents that looked official. Most of the photographs were of young men in military uniforms, standing in front of tents or military vehicles. Marcus recognized his grandfather in several of the photos, looking decades younger and somehow more serious than the gentleman Marcus remembered. The letters were mostly from army buddies, written in the casual style of young soldiers far from home. They mentioned places Marcus had never heard his grandfather talk about: remote outposts in Korea, training camps, and mysterious references to special assignments. One letter, dated 1953, mentioned something about the patch and how proud the writer was that William had earned his place with the unit. Among the documents, Marcus found what appeared to be a commendation letter, though much of it had been blacked out with heavy ink. The visible portions mentioned exceptional service under classified conditions and operations requiring the highest level of discretion and skill. At the bottom, there was an official signature and a seal that Marcus didn't recognize. The most intriguing discovery was a small notebook filled with his grandfather's handwriting. The entries were brief and cryptic, like a personal code. There were dates, coordinates, and references to people using only initials or nicknames. One entry from December 1952 simply read, "Received the lightning. Finally understand what it means to belong." Marcus realized that the lightning must refer to the patch he had found. But what did it mean to belong? And belong to what? Armed with this new information, Marcus returned to Bob's military surplus. Bob was fascinated by the photographs and documents, examining them with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. "These coordinates," Bob said, pointing to several entries in the notebook. "They're all in North Korea, well behind enemy lines. And look at these dates. They correspond with some major intelligence operations that happened during the war." Bob explained that during the Korean War, there were several classified units that operated deep in enemy territory, gathering intelligence and conducting special operations. These units were often made up of volunteers who had specific skills, language abilities, survival training, or technical expertise. Because of the dangerous and classified nature of their work, these units maintained strict secrecy, even decades after the war ended. "Your grandfather might have been part of something really significant," Bob told Marcus. "These weren't regular soldiers. These were specialists who risked their lives on missions that probably never made it into the history books." Bob suggested that Marcus attend the upcoming Veterans Reunion, which was now just a week away. He explained that several Korean War veterans would be there, including some who might have served in special operations units. If anyone would recognize that patch, Bob said, it would be someone who was there during that time period. Marcus left the surplus store feeling both excited and nervous. The quiet grandfather he had known was beginning to emerge as someone entirely different. A young man who had volunteered for dangerous missions in a foreign country. Someone who had earned his place in an elite unit through courage and skill. That evening, Marcus called his father again to share what he had discovered. David was amazed by the photographs and documents his son had found. "I had no idea Dad had saved all of this," David said when Marcus described the footlocker's contents. "He never mentioned any special assignments or dangerous missions. To us, he was just Dad, the guy who taught us to fish and always had time to help with homework." David agreed to come with Marcus to the Veterans Reunion. He admitted that he was now curious about his father's military service and wanted to understand why William had kept this part of his life so private. As the reunion approached, Marcus found himself studying the patch more closely each evening. Under a magnifying glass, he could make out more details. The lightning bolt appeared to have Korean characters incorporated into its design, and the shield underneath had what looked like a small map outline. The motto around the edge, while still difficult to read, seemed to include the words, "Silent and strike." Marcus also discovered something else while examining the patch under bright light. On the back, in tiny letters that were barely visible, was a serial number and what appeared to be his grandfather's initials, WT. This wasn't just any patch. It had been specifically made for his grandfather. The night before the reunion, Marcus carefully placed the patch in a small protective case. Tomorrow, he hoped, he would finally learn what it meant and understand the secret part of his grandfather's life that had remained hidden for all these years. He had no idea that his search for answers was about to lead to a revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about the quiet man who had raised him. The Riverside Community Center was buzzing with activity when Marcus and his father arrived on Saturday morning. The Veterans Reunion had drawn over 100 people, ranging from elderly World War II veterans to younger men and women who had served in more recent conflicts. Red, white, and blue banners hung from the ceiling, and tables were set up throughout the main hall displaying military memorabilia, photographs, and information about different veteran organizations. Marcus clutched the small case containing his grandfather's patch, feeling both nervous and excited. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing a simple button-down shirt and dress pants, wanting to show respect for the veterans he was about to meet. His father, David, stayed close beside him, equally curious about what they might discover. They started by walking through the displays, looking at the various military artifacts and photographs. Marcus stopped at several tables, showing the patch to different veterans and explaining his quest to understand its meaning. Most of the veterans were helpful and interested, but none recognized the specific design. A few mentioned that it looked like it could be from a special operations unit, confirming what Bob Martinez had suggested. After about an hour of conversations with various veterans, Marcus and David found themselves at a table displaying Korean War artifacts. An elderly man named Frank Patterson, who had served as a radio operator during the conflict, examined the patch carefully. "I've seen a few special unit patches over the years," Frank said, adjusting his glasses to get a better look. "This one is definitely unique. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and those Korean characters worked into the lightning bolt design suggest it was made specifically for operations in that region." Frank suggested that Marcus talk to some of the higher-ranking veterans who might have had more exposure to classified operations. He pointed across the room to where several men in military dress uniforms were gathered near the main stage. "See that group over there?" Frank said. "Those are some of the senior officers who help organize these reunions. If anyone would know about special operations patches, it would be one of them." Marcus thanked Frank and made his way across the crowded room with his father. As they approached the group of uniformed men, Marcus noticed that several were wearing impressive arrays of ribbons and medals on their dress uniforms. These were clearly veterans who had served with distinction and risen to high ranks during their military careers. The group was engaged in conversation about upcoming veteran benefit programs when Marcus politely approached. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command noticed Marcus waiting nearby. "Can I help you, young man?" the officer asked with a warm but authoritative voice. Marcus introduced himself and explained about his grandfather's patch, describing his search to understand its meaning. The officer, who introduced himself as retired Brigadier General James Morrison, listened with interest as Marcus told his story. "I'd be happy to take a look," General Morrison said. "I've encountered quite a few specialized unit insignia over the years." Marcus carefully opened the case and handed the patch to the general. The moment General Morrison's eyes focused on the patch, his entire demeanor changed. His casual, friendly expression shifted to one of intense recognition, and something that looked almost like awe. He held the patch closer to his eyes, studying every detail with an intensity that made Marcus's heart race. The conversation around them continued, but General Morrison seemed to have forgotten everything else in the room. He turned the patch over, examining the back where Marcus had discovered his grandfather's initials. When he saw the WT marking, the general's face went pale. "Where did you say you got this?" General Morrison asked, his voice now quiet and serious. Marcus repeated his story about finding it in his grandfather's belongings. He mentioned his grandfather's name, William Thompson, and the service dates he had discovered in his research. General Morrison stared at Marcus for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. Then, without saying a word, the general stepped back and came to a position of attention. In front of the entire group of veterans and with dozens of people nearby watching, General Morrison rendered a perfect military salute. The room seemed to quiet around them. Other veterans had noticed what was happening, and conversations began to fade as people turned to watch this unexpected display of military courtesy. General Morrison held the salute for several seconds before slowly lowering his hand. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a mixture of respect and emotion that Marcus had never heard before. "Ghost Wolf," the general whispered, just loud enough for Marcus and his father to hear. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you say?" "Ghost Wolf," General Morrison repeated, slightly louder this time. "That was your grandfather's call sign." The general looked around at the gathering crowd of veterans, many of whom had moved closer when they saw him salute. Several of the older Korean War veterans were staring at the patch in the general's hands with expressions of recognition and amazement. "Gentlemen," General Morrison announced to the group, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, "we are in the presence of the grandson of William Ghost Wolf Thompson." A murmur went through the crowd of veterans. Marcus could see nods of recognition from several of the older men, and one veteran actually removed his cap in what appeared to be a gesture of respect. Marcus felt overwhelmed and confused. His quiet grandfather, who had taught him to fish and fix cars, apparently had a reputation among these veterans that he had never imagined. "I don't understand," Marcus said to General Morrison. "What does Ghost Wolf mean? And why did you salute?" General Morrison handed the patch back to Marcus with the careful reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "Son," the general said, "this patch represents one of the most classified and dangerous units that operated during the Korean War. It was called Operation Silent Strike, and it was made up of volunteers who conducted deep reconnaissance and special operations behind enemy lines." The general paused, looking at the faces of the veterans around them. Several were nodding, and Marcus could see that some of them knew exactly what the general was talking about. "Your grandfather wasn't just a member of that unit," General Morrison continued. "According to the records I've had access to, William Thompson was one of the most effective operatives in the entire program. He saved lives, gathered critical intelligence, and completed missions that most people would consider impossible." Marcus felt like the world had shifted around him. His father stood beside him with his mouth slightly open, clearly as shocked as Marcus by this revelation. "But why was it kept secret?" David asked. "Why didn't he ever tell us any of this?" General Morrison's expression grew more serious. "Because the men who served in Operation Silent Strike were sworn to secrecy for life. Their missions were so sensitive and so dangerous that the military decided the program would remain classified indefinitely. Even today, most of the details are still restricted." Marcus looked down at the patch in his hands. This small piece of fabric represented a part of his grandfather's life that had been completely hidden from his family for over 60 years. "There's more you need to know," General Morrison said quietly, "and I think it's time you learned the full story of what your grandfather did during the war." General Morrison suggested they move to a quieter area where they could talk privately. He led Marcus and David to a small conference room adjacent to the main hall, motioning for a few of the older Korean War veterans to join them. As they settled around a rectangular table, Marcus noticed that each of the veterans who had followed them carried themselves with the same quiet dignity he had always associated with his grandfather. "What I'm about to tell you," General Morrison began, "is information that has been classified for over 70 years. But given the circumstances, and the fact that your grandfather has passed away, I believe you have a right to know who he really was." The general folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Marcus. Operation Silent Strike was created in 1952 as a response to the changing nature of the Korean conflict. The war had settled into a brutal stalemate, with both sides dug into defensive positions. Traditional military operations weren't providing the intelligence we needed to break the deadlock. One of the other veterans, a thin man named Colonel Robert Hayes, picked up the story. The military command decided to create small teams of highly trained specialists who could operate independently behind enemy lines. These weren't regular soldiers. They were volunteers who had specific skills and the psychological makeup to handle extreme isolation and danger. Marcus listened intently as General Morrison continued. "Your grandfather was recruited for the program because of his unique combination of abilities. He had grown up hunting and tracking in the Nebraska wilderness, so he understood how to move silently through hostile territory. He also had an exceptional memory for details and could remain calm under extreme pressure." "But what exactly did they do?" David asked, still trying to process this information about his father. Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "The silent strike teams were inserted deep into North Korean territory, sometimes hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. They would establish hidden observation posts and gather intelligence on troop movements, supply lines, and strategic installations. They operated completely alone with no backup and no communication with headquarters for weeks at a time." General Morrison nodded. "Your grandfather earned the call sign Ghost Wolf because of his ability to move through enemy territory without being detected. He could travel for days without leaving a trace, and he had an almost supernatural ability to avoid enemy patrols." Another veteran, a stocky man named Sergeant Major Tom Rodriguez, spoke up. "I was part of the communications team that received reports from the Silent Strike operatives. Ghost Wolf's intelligence reports were always the most detailed and accurate. He would describe enemy positions with such precision that our artillery could target them with minimal ammunition waste." Marcus felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. The grandfather who had patiently taught him to tie fishing knots had apparently been one of the military's most skilled covert operatives. "How long did he do this?" Marcus asked. "Nearly 2 years, General Morrison replied. "From late 1952 until the armistice was signed in 1954. During that time, he completed over 30 missions behind enemy lines. Each mission lasted between 2 and 6 weeks, and each one required him to penetrate deeper into enemy territory than most soldiers ever see. Colonel Hayes pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "I've kept some unofficial records over the years," he said. "According to my notes, Ghost Wolf's intelligence directly contributed to the success of at least 15 major operations. His reports helped save hundreds of Allied lives by identifying enemy ambush positions and supply caches. But the most important mission," General Morrison said, his voice becoming more solemn, "happened in the winter of 1953. North Korean forces had captured an Allied reconnaissance team and were holding them at a prison camp about 200 miles behind enemy lines. A rescue operation was impossible through conventional means. The camp was too heavily guarded and too remote. Sergeant Major Rodriguez took over the story. Your grandfather volunteered to infiltrate the area and gather intelligence for a potential rescue mission. The plan was for him to observe the camp for 2 weeks and report back on guard patterns and security measures." "What happened?" Marcus asked, though something in the veteran's expressions told him this story wasn't going to have a simple ending. General Morrison was quiet for a moment before continuing. "Ghost Wolf discovered that the captured soldiers were being tortured for information, and that they were scheduled to be moved to a more secure facility within 48 hours. If they were moved, they would effectively disappear forever. Your grandfather made a decision that went against his orders," Colonel Hayes said. "Instead of just gathering intelligence, he decided to attempt a rescue on his own." Marcus felt his heart racing. This was a side of his grandfather he could never have imagined. How could one person rescue a group of prisoners from a guarded camp? David asked. Sergeant Major Rodriguez smiled grimly. Ghost Wolf had studied the camp for days and had identified a weakness in their security. The guards rotated shifts at predictable times, and there was a brief window each night when the perimeter was less heavily watched. General Morrison continued the story. "On the night of February 15, 1953, your grandfather infiltrated the prison camp. He neutralized 3 guards silently, freed the captured soldiers, and led them on a 6-day journey through enemy territory back to Allied lines. All 6 prisoners survived," Colonel Hayes added. "They were suffering from malnutrition and injuries, but Ghost Wolf had managed to get them medical supplies during the escape and had guided them along routes that avoided enemy patrols." Marcus stared at the patch in his hands, trying to reconcile this story with the gentle man who had always been available for Sunday dinner and had never missed one of his high school baseball games. "Why didn't he ever tell us any of this?" Marcus asked. "Why keep it secret from his family?" General Morrison's expression grew sad. "Because the psychological cost of that kind of service is enormous. Your grandfather spent 2 years living in constant danger, knowing that capture meant certain death or worse. He saw things and did things that no person should ever have to experience. Many of the silent strike operatives had difficulty readjusting to civilian life," Colonel Hayes explained. "The military provided some counseling, but in those days, there wasn't much understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress. Most of these men chose to lock away that part of their lives and never speak of it again." Sergeant Major Rodriguez nodded. "Your grandfather was one of the lucky ones. He was able to build a normal life, have a family, and find peace. Many of the other operatives struggled with depression, alcoholism, or worse. Ghost Wolf managed to put the war behind him and become the man you knew." Marcus realized that his grandfather's quiet nature, his preference for peaceful activities like fishing, and his gentle approach to everything in life had been his way of healing from experiences that most people couldn't imagine surviving. "The patch," General Morrison said, pointing to the emblem in Marcus's hands, "was created specifically for Operation Silent Strike. Only 37 men ever earned the right to wear it. Your grandfather was one of the most distinguished among them." Marcus looked around the table at these veterans who had known his grandfather in a completely different context. To them, William Thompson hadn't been a quiet grandfather. He had been a legendary operative whose courage and skill had saved lives and changed the course of military operations. "There's one more thing you should know," General Morrison said quietly. "The rescue mission that your grandfather carried out, one of the soldiers he saved was a young lieutenant who went on to become a general himself. That general spent the rest of his career making sure that the men of Operation Silent Strike received the recognition they deserved. even if it had to remain classified. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he finally understood the full significance of the small patch he had found in his grandfather's belongings. It represented not just military service but extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and a hidden legacy of heroism that had remained secret for over 70 years. Over the next hour, the veteran shared more stories about Marcus's grandfather that painted a picture of a man who had been both extraordinarily brave and deeply human. Each story revealed another layer of the person William Thompson had been during those dangerous years in Korea. Colonel Hayes told Marcus about a letter he had received from his grandfather in 1953, describing how Ghost Wolf had spent an entire night in freezing temperatures, waiting for the perfect moment to photograph enemy supply routes. Your grandfather wrote that he kept himself awake by thinking about the farm he wanted to buy someday and the family he hoped to have, the colonel said. Even in the middle of a war zone, he was dreaming about the peaceful life he eventually built. Sergeant Major Rodriguez shared a story about how Ghost Wolf had once shared his rations with a group of Korean civilians who were hiding from both armies in a destroyed village. He was supposed to avoid all contact with civilians to maintain his cover, Rodriguez explained. But your grandfather couldn't walk away from a family with hungry children. He gave them most of his food and spent an extra 3 days in enemy territory because he had to forage for supplies. These stories helped Marcus understand how his grandfather's wartime experiences had shaped the man he became. The patience William had shown when teaching Marcus to fish suddenly made sense. It was the same patience that had allowed him to wait motionless for hours while observing enemy positions. The way his grandfather had always seemed to notice everything around him, from changes in the weather to when someone was feeling sad, now appeared to be skills he had developed during years of survival in hostile territory. General Morrison pulled out a manila folder that he had brought with him to the reunion. I took the liberty of bringing some additional information that I thought you might want to see, he said. These are declassified after-action reports from some of your grandfather's missions. Marcus opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were several typewritten documents, many with sections blacked out, but enough visible text to provide glimpses into his grandfather's wartime service. One report described how Operative Ghost Wolf successfully infiltrated target area and provided detailed intelligence on enemy fortifications, enabling successful Allied advance with minimal nuclear casualties. Another mentioned his exceptional fieldcraft and ability to remain undetected in hostile territory for extended periods, but it was a personal commendation, letter that affected Marcus the most. The letter, signed by a commanding general, praised William Thompson for extraordinary courage and selfless dedication to the mission and to his fellow soldiers. The letter specifically mentioned the prison camp rescue and noted that Operative Thompson's actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and demonstrate a level of personal courage that few possess. Your grandfather never saw this letter, General Morrison explained. It was classified and filed away with the rest of the silent strike records. But I wanted you to know that his service was officially recognized, even if he never received public acknowledgement. David, who had been quietly listening to these stories about his father, finally spoke up. I'm starting to understand some things about Dad that never made sense before, he said. He always seemed to know when something was wrong before anyone else noticed, and he never got rattled by emergencies or stressful situations. Marcus nodded, remembering how his grandfather had remained calm during a severe thunderstorm that had terrified Marcus as a child. William had simply sat with him on the porch, pointing out the beauty of the lightning and explaining how storms worked, never showing any fear despite the dangerous conditions. Colonel Hayes smiled. Your grandfather had nerves of steel, but he also had a lot of compassion. I remember reading reports where he would mention seeing evidence of how the war was affecting civilian populations. He never forgot that there were innocent people caught in the middle of the conflict. This explained another aspect of Marcus's grandfather that had always stood out, his generosity toward people who were struggling. William had regularly helped neighbors with repairs, brought food to elderly residents of their community, and had always found ways to help without making anyone feel embarrassed about needing assistance. Sergeant Major Rodriguez shared one final story that brought everything into focus for Marcus. After the armistice was signed in 1954, all the silent strike operatives were debriefed and sworn to secrecy about their missions. Most of them were eager to get home and put the war behind them. But your grandfather asked if he could stay in Korea for an extra month to help with humanitarian efforts. He volunteered to help distribute food and medical supplies to refugee camps. Rodriguez continued. Even after 2 years of the most dangerous military service imaginable, Ghostwolf wanted to spend more time helping people rebuild their lives. Marcus realized that this was the key to understanding his grandfather's character. The same qualities that had made him an exceptional covert operative, patience, observation skills, quiet determination, and deep concern for others, had also made him an exceptional grandfather and community member. General Morrison looked at his watch and noted that the reunion was beginning to wind down. There's a group of us who meet annually to honor the memory of the silent strike operatives, he told Marcus. We've lost most of them over the years, but we maintain contact with their families when possible. You and your father would be welcome to join us. The general also explained that there had been efforts over the years to have Operation Silent Strike officially recognized and declassified. There's a possibility that within the next few years the full story of your grandfather's service might become public record, he said. If that happens, Ghostwolf will finally receive the public recognition he deserved. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Colonel Hayes handed Marcus a small pin that looked similar to the lightning bolt design on his grandfather's patch. This is an unofficial memorial pin that we have made for family members of silent strike operatives, he explained. We want to make sure their sacrifice is remembered, even if it has to remain private for now. Marcus carefully placed the pin next to his grandfather's patch in the protective case. As they rejoined the main reunion gathering, several other veterans approached to shake Marcus's hand and share brief memories of hearing about Ghostwolf's legendary missions. Walking to their car afterward, Marcus and David were both quiet, processing everything they had learned. The drive home gave them time to reflect on how this new knowledge changed their understanding of William Thompson. You know what's amazing? David said as they pulled into Marcus's driveway. All those years Dad was carrying these incredible experiences and memories. But he chose to focus on being present for us instead of living in the past. Marcus nodded, realizing that his grandfather's decision to keep his military service private had been an act of love. William had chosen to be a peaceful grandfather rather than a war hero, prioritizing his family's happiness over his own recognition. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment looking at the patch and thinking about all the stories he had heard. His grandfather had been a man of extraordinary courage and skill, but he had also been exactly the person Marcus had always known him to be: kind, patient, generous, and quietly strong. The difference was that now Marcus understood where those qualities had come from and what they had cost. 6 months after the veterans' reunion, Marcus found himself standing in his grandfather's old fishing spot by Miller's Creek, holding the patch and thinking about how much his life had changed since that day he first showed it to Bob Martinez. The morning was peaceful, with early sunlight filtering through the trees and casting dancing shadows on the slow-moving water. This had always been his grandfather's favorite place, and now Marcus understood why William had been drawn to such quiet, healing spaces. The patch now rested in a place of honor in Marcus's apartment, displayed in a custom frame alongside the memorial pin and some of the photographs he had found in his grandfather's footlocker. But more importantly, the story behind the patch had become a bridge connecting Marcus to a part of his family history he had never known existed. In the months following the reunion, Marcus had stayed in contact with General Morrison and the other veterans. They had shared additional stories and photographs, helping him piece together a more complete picture of his grandfather's military service. The general had been true to his word about including Marcus in the annual memorial gathering, and Marcus had attended his first silent strike remembrance ceremony just 2 weeks earlier. At that ceremony, Marcus had met the families of other Operation Silent Strike veterans. He discovered that many of them had similar stories, children and grandchildren who had grown up knowing very little about their relatives' military service, only to learn later about extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice. The common thread among all these families was that their veterans had chosen to focus on building peaceful, loving homes rather than dwelling on their wartime experiences. Marcus had also received a call from a military historian who was working on a book about classified Korean War operations. The historian explained that Operation Silent Strike was finally being considered for declassification, and that William Thompson's story would likely be included in the official record. Your grandfather's missions were some of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire war, the historian had told Marcus. Ghostwolf's work directly contributed to shortening the conflict and saving lives, but perhaps the most meaningful change in Marcus's life had been how this knowledge affected his relationship with his own father. David had become fascinated with learning more about his father's military service, and he and Marcus had spent many evenings going through the documents and photographs they had found. These conversations had brought them closer together and had given David a new understanding of the man who had raised him. Dad always seemed to know exactly what to say when I was struggling with something, David had told Marcus one evening. Now I realize he probably developed that ability by learning to read people and situations during the war. He could see when someone needed help or encouragement. Marcus had also begun to notice how his grandfather's influence extended beyond their immediate family. At the auto repair shop where Marcus worked, he found himself approaching problems with the same patient, methodical attitude his grandfather had always displayed. When a coworker was going through a difficult divorce, Marcus had quietly helped him with car repairs and had listened without judgment, the same way his grandfather had always been available for people who needed support. The patch had become more than just a family artifact. It had become a reminder of the values his grandfather had lived by, both during and after the war. Courage didn't always mean dramatic acts of heroism. Sometimes it meant the quiet strength to build a good life and to help others whenever possible. Marcus had also reached out to some of the soldiers his grandfather had rescued during that winter mission in 1953. One of them, now in his 90s, had written Marcus a letter describing how Ghostwolf had kept the group's spirits up during their dangerous journey back to Allied lines. Your grandfather told us stories about his home in Nebraska, the letter read. He described the fishing spots where he wanted to take his future children, and the kind of peaceful life he hoped to build after the war. Those stories gave us hope when we didn't think we would survive. Ghostwolf wasn't just brave, he was the kind of person who could imagine a better future even in the darkest circumstances. Reading that letter, Marcus had finally understood why his grandfather had been so committed to creating a stable, loving family environment. William Thompson had spent 2 years surrounded by danger and violence, and he had used that experience to become more determined than ever to build something peaceful and good. As Marcus stood by the creek that morning, he thought about the conversation he had planned to have with his own future children someday. He would tell them about their great-grandfather, not just as the gentleman who had taught him to fish, but as someone who had demonstrated that true strength came from using your abilities to protect and help others. General Morrison had given Marcus a copy of an unofficial motto that the Silent Strike operatives had adopted: courage in darkness, peace in light. Marcus now understood that his grandfather had lived by that motto his entire life, showing courage when it was needed and creating peace whenever possible. The patch had taught Marcus that heroism didn't always come with recognition or public acknowledgement. Sometimes the most important acts of courage happened in secret, and sometimes the greatest strength was shown in choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his father. "Dad," he said when David answered, "I'm at Grandpa's fishing spot. I was thinking we should bring the grandkids here next weekend and teach them to fish. I want to tell them some stories about their great-grandfather." "That sounds perfect," David replied. "What kind of stories are you planning to tell them?" Marcus looked down at the clear water flowing past his feet, the same water his grandfather had loved. "I'm going to tell them about a man who learned to be brave when he had to be, and who chose to be gentle when he could be. I'm going to tell them about Ghostwolf, and about the grandfather who taught me that the most important battles are the ones you fight to protect the people you love." When Marcus finally headed home that morning, he felt a deep sense of connection to his grandfather's legacy. The patch had revealed not just a hidden history, but a living example of how to face life's challenges with courage and integrity. William Thompson had kept his military service secret not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had wanted his family to know him as he had chosen to become. rather than as the war had temporarily shaped him. That evening, Marcus carefully placed the patch back in its protective case, but he no longer saw it as a mysterious artifact from the past. It was a reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, and that the quiet heroes among us often carry the most important stories of all. Ghost Wolf's legend had finally found its way home, and his legacy would continue through the family he had worked so hard to protect and love.